Back now with coverage of the passing of Queen Elizabeth and the new reign of King Charles III, the bad royal blood between the brothers, William and Harry, and the potential healing capturing worldwide attention after yesterday's surprising joint public appearance with their wives, the royal reunion, the captivating people around the world in the wake of the Queen's passing. Let's bring in royal expert Jonathan Sacerdoti, journalist and special correspondent here to talk about all of these developments. First of all, the sons, Jonathan, they obeyed not only their father's order, but the king's order to sideline their feud ahead of their grandmother's funeral, the Queen's funeral. So do you think this will last and the brothers and their wives will reunite?
Well, first off, can I just send my condolences to the American people on the anniversary of 9/11? As every year, I'm thinking of the victims and their families and the first responders. And onto the story of the royal feud, I think that really it's a distraction from what's going on at the moment. And that seems to be the way in which everyone's behaved, to respect that this is not the time for feuding between the brothers. This is not the time for Meghan Markle to be throwing bombs or insults at the royal family. This is a time for remembering Queen Elizabeth II and her extraordinary service to the nation over 70 years, the longest ever. And of course, I think it would be quite justified if King Charles III had said to his sons, this is the time that you put on a united front, you go out there and you talk to the crowds on the terms that they've come here on, which is to respect the passing of his mother, the monarch, and indeed to celebrate, if it's a bit premature to use that word, his accession to the throne.
Understood and agreed. Meanwhile, many frayed feelings over the past couple of years beneath the cordial appearances that we're looking at there. What will it take to heal these relationships?
Honestly, I'm not sure if it's possible to heal them because so much damage has probably been done in the circumstances, and it all seems quite deliberate as well. However, I think what could happen and may well happen is that there's a period of some silence. Maybe that's wishful thinking, but I think that really the Meghan and Harry show has been somewhat eclipsed by what's going on within the royal family. And those who are interested in royal stories are really looking at this historical moment, this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to see the passing of power from Queen Elizabeth down to her son, King Charles. This is something that very few people have seen happen before who are alive now. Even fewer would remember it if they have seen it. So I think this is just the moment when bigger things are in the news, bigger things are in people's minds. And today, especially, and until the funeral, I think people are thinking of Her Majesty the Queen most of all.
Her Majesty the Queen is in the hearts of, I believe, most people, if not everyone. But, you know, there is the talk of this reunion, if you will, that is there. It, regardless if we want to talk about it or not, that's what's happening. And you mentioned a minute ago that you feel like there was a deliberate attempt. I'm not sure what you meant by that or who you were referring to.
Well, I don't think it's accidental when people sign massive multi-million-dollar deals to air their problems with the royal family. And I think that looking at what Harry and Meghan have done in the past, it has really been to trade on the gripes they have with the family, the problems they have with the royal family, which may well be justified, may not be, but it seems a strange way to seek independence from that family and to try and make their own way in the world. I think that's how most British people have felt. But as I said, I think today and during this period, even they seem to have managed to put that behind them so that they were in the country coincidentally, so they're able to take part in this tribute to the Queen, and they're able to take part in showing their respect to the monarch of the United Kingdom, even though they left as working royals and chose to live their life in America. And I think that King Charles made it very clear when he first addressed the nation as the king that he said they were loved members of the family. Actually, I think he's carrying on the technique that was used by the Queen in her turn when she would say pretty much only that about Harry and Meghan after they left. And whatever they said about the royal family, she answered they were much loved members of the family. He said the same thing in his speech and no more about them because they have said they didn't really want to be part of the general show, the circus that is the royal family.
Let me ask you this quickly, the little time we have left. Prince Harry's memoir is scheduled to be released late November, reportedly a tell-all perhaps airing royal dirty laundry. It's their perspective, his and Meghan's perspective on their lives as the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. Should he postpone the release to add this new chapter of perhaps reconciliation, or rewrite it entirely? What do you think, or just not even do the book at this point?
Who knows what he's able to do? I mean, you make a multi-million-dollar deal with publishers and they have some amount of say over what you can do. They wouldn't have paid that money unless they felt they were getting a good story out of it. So I would say that one can only hope that the book is sensitive to the family. One could have hoped it was sensitive to the family before, but now that the Queen is dead, it may be even more inappropriate if there are too many explosive allegations in there. And I think that their perspective is perfectly valid. They have every right to share their perspective in their books. But obviously, people within the royal family are right to react to that as well.
Well, I want to end on the Queen and what she represented: dignity, grace, loyalty, unity. Let's end on that positive note. Jonathan Sacerdoti, thank you very much.
Good to be with you.